Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books. And Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're really excited to be with you tonight, celebrating one of my favorite books so far of 2021, A Night at the Sweet Gum Head, Drag, Drugs, Disco, and Atlanta's Gay Revolution by Martin Padgett. We are joined today by Martin Padgett and Samantha Allen, another one of our favorite historians and writers and sociologists and community chroniclers. So Samantha Allen is the author of Real Queer America, LGBT Stories from Red States, which won the Judy Turner Prize for Community Service from the Decatur Book Festival. And we got to help present that award to her, which now feels like quite a long time ago, but it wasn't so long ago. She is also a GLAAD Award-winning journalist and editor whose work has been published by the New York Times, Rolling Stone, CNN, and more. And we got some very good news this week, which is that her debut novel has just been announced in the world, and we're gonna hear a little treat from Samantha about that. The pre-order link is not quite ready, but we'll be making sure that Karis is the first to tweet that out of all the bookstores in the world, because we're so excited. So we'll be talking about the difference between nonfiction and fiction and so much more. But we're thrilled to have Samantha with us. And Martin Padgett has an MFA from the University of Georgia's Grady College of Journalism and received a 2019 Lambda Literary Fellowship. He has written for Oxford American, Gravy, Details, and Business Week, and he lives in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm thrilled to have you both here. I'm thrilled for all of you to be watching at home with us. One of the things that we love is if you, like me, are a native Atlantan and you remember various clubs, bars, places you used to hang out. It's so fun to hear about those things. So feel free to drop stories in the chat. If you are watching from somewhere else, feel free to tell us where you're watching from. If you ever went to the Sweet Gum Head or other places and you want to remind us, please put that in there. We love to hear it. And then finally, if you would like to ask a question, click the Ask a Question box in the bottom roughly center of your screen, and Samantha will start incorporating those questions about 3/4 of the way through the event. So I'm going to get out of the way, let these folks get to it, and welcome to you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Martin, I'm thrilled to chat with you, and what a fantastic book. It's a history book that reads like a disco, rock and roll, multi-perspective novel. It's so engaging, so fun, and I think has a lot to say to our queer present. So I just wanted to quickly gush about the book and before I start to ask you about it. But, I know we'll have some longtime Atlantans in the chat. I'm an ex-Atlantan. I lived there from 2010 to 2015. I had not heard of the Sweet Gum Head. So for anyone listening who doesn't know what this fantastic nightclub is, or who's heard of Studio 54 but has not heard of the Sweet Gum Head, enlighten us about what made it so special and what made it worthy of kind of a book-length examination.
It is great to be with you. When I started working on my MFA before this was even a book, I had read your book. And when you introduce it, you talk about the usual story of a queer person leaves the country to go to the big city, and you use it as a counterpoint. This is a truth. It's also a trope, and you set out on this amazing journey to tell something different. So that led me to realize if I told a queer story, it was going to have to be structured differently, and it might all be like back of the office plumbing stuff, except for writers. But I looked at it as an anti-fairy tale. I knew I had this story about this nightclub, and it's not a place where you would set a fairy tale. These are not the people who would normally populate it, but it had some of the same elements to it. And I didn't know anything about the club at first. I had started writing a story about Cheshire Bridge Road in general, and kept narrowing the story down until I just thought, this isn't working. I need to find something in this rubble and recast the story. And I found the name of the club, and I didn't know about it either. And I had moved here in '97. I'd been coming here for just about every weekend for the 2 years before that. I was shocked. I'd been to just about every bar in town, I thought, and I wanted to know more about this one. So I started to Google and research and found a couple of bios. I found a great story in Atlanta Magazine, an interview with Lena Lust, who was one of the performers who appeared on stage frequently in the latter years the club was open. And just based on the name alone, I'm like, I got to find out more about this place. It just, who names a club that? What does that mean? Does it mean what I think it means? And turns out, no, it didn't mean what I thought it meant. There are just so many things that I figured out within just a few minutes of looking around on the computer. And when I started to ask questions, people were so universally helpful and warm and wanting to relive that part of their lives, because a lot of it got left behind when people started to care for their friends and lovers who were sick with AIDS. So this whole decade of happiness and discovery and optimism got put aside. And now, I thought there are so many great stories that have been told about the political dynamics and failures of the AIDS era itself. I want to do something different. I want to do something about a happier time. And AIDS does inflect the story, but the happier time turned out to have all these twists and turns that I was not expecting.
Yeah, I think too, it feels like there's a renewed interest in that kind of 70s era of LGBTQ history. I'm thinking about the Halston show that just came out on Netflix. Right. But often, speaking of Halston, when we tell stories about this part of LGBTQ history, they're often stories about New York or San Francisco. It's stories about Stonewall, or it's about Gilbert Baker inventing the pride flag. Tell me about kind of like claiming Atlanta as part of that history as well with this book.
I worried. I went through a long process of writing a proposal and connecting with an agent who was interested in it. And along the way, a couple of mentors of mine just kept reminding me, you have something different here. Nobody's done Atlanta. Nobody understands why it's important. And it is kind of this third space where I think the way that I've put it together is, once the queer rights movement had started to accelerate, it got critical mass in the coasts, New York, LA, San Francisco. But the South is different. And if it was going to spread around the South, Atlanta was the place to set up a beachhead. So the people who did this vital work in the 70s to try and establish just an awareness of what queer civil rights would look like, and why it was important and why it was going to be here one way or the other. It was a much longer process and a much smaller group of people who ended up fusing together in a way that involved a lot of different things that, to me, it's striking that it becomes a story of nightlife too, like it had in other cities, but it's got that unique Atlanta twist to it. Having gone through all the pieces and tried to figure out what makes it different from those other cities, it's just the fact that Atlanta was still steeped in a religious culture. Georgia was still very conservative. Atlanta hadn't replaced Georgia. Atlanta hadn't grown bigger than Georgia. It was still growing, and it was still trying to decide what it was going to be when it grew up. And the gay rights movement kind of intersected with Atlanta trying to decide what its public persona would be. And I think now we realize that this is a vital and important part of it. But back then it was by no means clear. And it really wasn't until Maynard Jackson became mayor that it was even acknowledged.
Yeah, yeah. Do you feel like Atlanta is having that moment now of recognition of its cultural and historical importance? Or do you feel like we've skipped straight to Atlanta is the place where they film Marvel movies in big warehouses?
It's both. Just last weekend, I drove by the house where Michael Hardwick was arrested for sodomy on my way to have breakfast at Mrs. P's, which is now a boutique restaurant inside a boutique hotel in what used to be after hours basement gay bar. And to me, that's Atlanta. That is the arc. What once was will now be a condo or a boutique hotel.
Yeah,
it's not the most glorious outcome, but it's an outcome to deal with.
Before we get too down and talk about gentrification a little later, I wanted to ask you, of all the amazing queer folks in Atlanta in the 70s, how did you settle on your kind of two lead figures / characters.
So, you know, the what we're left to interpret is only what people cared to preserve along the way. And even the archives that were available seem to be a little scattered and thin. It's ironic that the best collection of some of the gay media for Atlanta is at the Duke University archives. The Alpha, the lesbian organization, had this amazing collection of publications from that era, and they decided that the Duke Library is the best place for it. So I found some there. I found some at Cornell. It was part of it was the difficulty in just finding material. This was still a day when people didn't think that our voices were worth preserving or publishing. So it happened that John Greenwell, who was Rachel Wells on stage, had written a memoir and published it online, and continues to, you know, he's a writer and has written plays and short stories. And it's good to have a writer in the background who is conscious of what they thought was important. And the other writer is Bill Smith, the city council member, not city council, he was a city commissioner, and he ran the gay newspaper in town. So he published regular editorials. And he was also the kind of person who would write notes to friends. So there are some of his handwritten letters at the Atlanta History Center. That's an era where there's not a lot of video available, but there's a little bit of him. And between those primary sources, then it's the secondary sources. And I hate saying secondary in that sense. It's just a historian thing. It's not a personal thing. There's still a lot of people who live here. They came here, they were performers and they were club goers, and they stayed in Atlanta. And there's a half dozen that I called on regularly to answer questions. And again, they were so giving of their time. I could keep going back to the well and asking, why was this important? Who was this person? What did they do then? And you know, now's the time to capture people's memories.
Yeah, I mean, you bring to mind that it is kind of a race against the clock right now.
Always a race against time.
We lost so much oral history because of AIDS, obviously, and now we're kind of facing mortality as like another ticking clock for folks who remember that era vividly enough to turn it into history. Did you feel pressure to kind of get this down while you could?
Yes, yes, I feel pressure just because thinking of my memories of being here in Atlanta in the middle of the 90s is it 25 or 35? I'm not math. It's a generation ago. And I can remember it vividly now. Will I remember it vividly in 5 or 10 years? Probably not. And I haven't started my own recollection list. I haven't started writing down what I remember. Some of the visuals and sights and sounds of gay Atlanta in the 1990s are still pretty sharp with me. But you know, and I think I can see both sides of it now. Like, what do I think is important versus what I'm finding is important to me looking back.
Yeah. Let's talk craft a little bit, because the book is written so engagingly. So you gather these interviews, secondary sources, firsthand sources. How do you start shaping it into this really kind of propulsive narrative that kind of hops in and out of people's perspectives?
And the way you do it is do not start like I did. I went through 3 or 4 drafts where it was just a fact dump, and that's a good place to start sometimes. But at some point I had to break it up and restructure it. And I had saved a couple of books to read because I knew they would influence me, and I wanted to get my ideas down before I actually looked at them. And the book that influenced me the most strongly was Dan Baum and Margaret Knox's 9 Lives, the book about New Orleans during Katrina. And it's told in vignettes, and it has multiple characters. Part of it takes place in a bar. And there are undertones of crime, and there are undertones of, you know, all kinds of racial and sexual and gender divides that keep the stories in opposition, but also keep them united. And I knew that there was going to be a lesson in it. So I read it, and then I wrote a note to Dan and to Meg about, you know, how do you even tackle this? When did you realize it was time to break it up into little digestible pieces? And they said they realized at some point that they were telling a story about the city itself, and the individual characters were primary, but the city itself was the thing that brought them all together. And I guess I decided at some point, all these people have like a common ambition, and Atlanta does too. And it needed to be about the city as much as it was about these other people.
Yeah. I mean, really, it's not the only way to tell a story about a city, but sometimes it can feel like the only way you can really get at what a place means is to view it through the lens of people who shaped it, experienced it, were
Yeah.
hurt by it, fell in love with it.
And I had the luxury of doing that.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
do see it as a luxury, all these people who made time for me or left things behind that could be studied.
That's, that's something I definitely found doing research for Real Queer America, traveling through the country, meeting, interviewing people, just how generous people were with their time because they knew either explicitly or just tacitly the importance of getting these stories preserved and published somewhere. Was that something you encountered with folks that you met and talked to for the book?
Absolutely. I think second phone call, or the first phone call actually, was to Leslie Jordan, who spoke for an hour, and I barely had to ask any questions because he just knew what I was interested in. And he laughed and he sang and told stories about his neighbor upstairs, Lily White, who just lost a week ago. How she would glue hair on her head and do Patsy Cline's Crazy and just rip every piece of hair off her head during the performance, and how they would drop acid together. And all this was kind of unprompted. I didn't know any of those things beforehand, just told them to me. And wanted someone to know that all those things had taken place. People are generous because they understand that, they may never get that chance to tell the story again in that way. And I always consciously felt this is why I got to get it right, because I am probably writing the life record of this person. I don't know that anyone else will approach the story or the same people that I did.
So if the book's a story in large part about Atlanta, do you feel like you learned something new or surprising about Atlanta researching it, or do you feel like it largely affirmed things that you kind of always understood about its history and place?
That's a fantastic question, and I'm not doing that just to delay. It's just this moment of recognition that there's definitely the story that I came in thinking that I would get, and then there's the stories that I was given and completely was unprepared for them. Some of the performers who were just willing to share pretty explicitly why they came here. And my moving to Atlanta was by choice, and it was affirmative. And other people's moves here was not out of choice necessarily. It was a refuge, and people were either kind of paid to stay out of their family's sphere, or explicitly thrown out of the house, or choosing to leave because they felt like there was no other opportunity, kind of a despondency from where they were, and to come here and to find some opportunity and friends and people who loved and cared for them. I can imagine that feeling. And that really resonated with me.
And again, I think it's so important to tell those kinds of stories about Atlanta, because when people think about that era, I think maybe there's a misconception. I certainly encountered it when I was shopping my book around, that Atlanta is the kind of place that someone would have gotten on a bus away from in that day to go to New York. And I'm sure there was some East Coast migration or things like that. But Atlanta was also the magnet for a lot of queer folks in other parts of Georgia and the American South, in ways that are obvious if you've lived there or spent time there. But having lived all over the country, it still feels like this invisible history. How do you kind of break through that?
That's a great question too. And since I haven't lived very many other places, well, I guess that's not true. I've lived in Detroit and grew up in DC and lived in Thailand for a little while. But you had this perspective of, seeing all of these different interpretations of queer culture across the country. And to me, this one almost feels more natural because of where I was raised. It's more similar to DC in the 70s. To me, discovering these things about Atlanta was like I was filling in a piece of history. Like all the histories I'd read of Atlanta were, there was Gone with the Wind, and then there was the Civil Rights era, and the story kind of ends the day, 1960. Originally, I wanted to start writing a book about the day after Martin Luther King was shot, because that, to me, that is the transference. Like now there is a mission to enact progress. And how do you do that? And I thought there was a physical way to describe it by following roads out of the center of Atlanta and seeing what stories came along from them. And I don't think anybody's ever tackled that kind of a comprehensive, the last 50 years of Atlanta. And I set out to do it and failed. But the way I failed, I thought was pretty interesting. So I kind of stuck with it.
Well, there's also a sense of kind of finding the universal in the specific. Maybe you didn't write the omnibus, the famous book about Robert Moses, but you kind of still get at that same history through the specific lens, I think.
It's not Tom Wolfe. It's not a drag queen in full. Certainly could have been that. There's, I wish I could have included dozens more people. And my tendency was to want to have everybody in it. And at some point, my editor very kindly reminded me that if I can't follow what's going on, other readers won't be able to follow what's going on either. So I had to trim some sections out. And luckily, the Bitter Southerner ran the Leslie Jordan story because it was just, his story just encapsulated. It was just so perfect, and he handed it to me basically. But then Oxford American ran a lot of what I had intended to be an intermission for the book. I always thought there was a musical structure to it, and I actually wrote an intermission that goes well back into Atlanta's history and talked about all these incidents of there were public arrests for cross-dressing, but there was public celebration for all kinds of male and female performance, blended identities. There was even one at the the Cotton States Expo on the grounds of what's now Piedmont Park, and all kinds of interesting historical things that stopped things cold and stopped the story from completing itself. So maybe one day I'll get to use that information.
Yeah, it's all rattling around in there, waiting for books to come.
Right. Yeah, it's rattling in my head right now. So
I've heard rumors of a Spotify playlist attached to the book.
There's a Spotify playlist. It's on my personal website. It's Spotify. If you just search the name for the book, it's the same. And that's my favorite part of it. I got to do deep dives into a bunch of these disco songs and some non-disco songs, but songs chosen by performers to do on stage. And I got to learn so much. And there are so many great books that have now been written about disco, and some are really heavily theoretical, and others do some of the investigation behind the artists. But I just love, like, I studied up about the Hughes Corporation and Rock the Boat, and never thought that there was that much out there. It's a one-hit wonder, and but it was a club hit for a long time. The artists had been jazz musicians. I mean, I think what I came away with quickly is that people tend to trash disco music and think that it's this gawky kind of tacky appeal. And I think people who are younger than me now look at it as kitsch, but seriously talented musicians, and really an exploration of form, especially when club mixes started to go to 12-minute long. How do you stitch together enough music for the DJ to be able to go do cocaine in the bathroom and get back? There's a practical need, and then there's an artistic urge behind disco. I could do that all day long.
Well, it's crying out for a needle drop filled TV adaptation. So let me ask you a silly question. Who would you cast as the leads?
John and Bell. When I think about all the people who have been who perform in certain roles, I always try to think of performers who have been on Drag Race, because I can see performers that I wouldn't normally see in a club around town. I always thought originally Willem Belli. Willem had the same kind of presence to be John Greenwell. But then I saw this great picture last year of Gigi Goode and Simone together, and they were posed like Donna Summer and Barbara Streisand from the Enough It Is Enough 12-inch mix. And it was identical. And I'm like, that's it. That's Hot Chocolate and Rachel Wells. And drag performers, they're on TV. They know how to follow scripts. They know how to impart emotion to the performances. I don't know why you wouldn't use performers like that.
Yeah,
Bill
yeah.
Smith's tougher.
Instead of teaching Benedict Cumberbatch how to do drag or something.
Which, you know, is its own interesting exercise, but what is it? What do you get at the end of the day? A Benedict Cumberbatch sounds like a great drag name to begin with, though. I will say
I'm
that.
sure it's the basis for many drag names.
Yeah, yeah. We entertained ourselves last week thinking of a list of drag names that I could sign books with, and a lot of them are unprintable. But we decided Paige Turner was the best one.
Excellent. And that link to the playlist is in the chat, I see. It's interesting to me that you mentioned that you started out kind of thinking about how could I tell this history through roads, because in addition to being a story about Atlanta, it's also a very interesting story about Cheshire Bridge Road, which is a very contested space right now. I've been following it a little since moving away from Atlanta, and was sad to learn that Tokyo Valentino is either closed or being targeted for closure, or
yeah, it's perpetually
just
targeted.
Adult businesses, nightclubs in that space seem to be under fire in a way that recalls, you know, stuff that happened in New York and Christopher Street in New York and 30 years ago, you know. Talk a little bit about Cheshire Bridge Road. Sorry.
No, I was waiting for that. Cheshire Bridge Road it's kind of in my neighborhood, right? I have not lived further than 2 miles away from it in 23 years. So I know it a little bit, and I wanted to know more, obviously. That's how I got here. So the Pink Pony was torn down and they built apartments on top of it. And there was a rumor that the Colonnade was going to be torn down along with the motel behind it, and that was going to be turned into condos. And very little discussion was had over what's here and who's here and how are we trying to preserve a neighborhood. And the irony is that, you know, this was part of a neighborhood that had itself, it was originally a farm, and the Cheshire Bridge was an actual bridge that crossed the Peachtree Creek, but it was kind of paved through in the 30s and 40s in the name of progress, and then the interstate was built next to it in the 60s in the name of progress. And in the early 2000s, City Council wanted to shut down all the adult businesses on Cheshire Bridge Road in the name of progress. And people forget that, you know, for a very long time, Cheshire Bridge, La Vista was one of the hubs of the queer community here. And hopefully that will be recognized in some way. But in some ways, it's like I was saying before, it's difficult to see that right now they're problems. I mean, they're empty storefronts, and it's hard to think of what could replace these places. And part of me just wants to have my old stomping grounds reconstituted. Even though I don't think I've been out to a bar after midnight in 10 years, I still want them to exist because I still want people to have that sense of in-person community that I had, because I felt like that was it was a soft landing. And I don't see how people have that today if they don't have that, and there are fewer public places to collect and to be together just as queer people.
Yeah, I mean, not to lean too far into existential terror, but it's kind of hard not to in these times sometimes. But you have the vanishing of, you know, kind of queer spaces like Cheshire Bridge Road, places that are accessible, like, you know, like you said, the soft landing, the place where you show up to a city with $100 in your bank account and find a community or a network, a way many of the people you interviewed for the book recall doing. And at the same time, you have, you know, various social media platforms have restricted adult content, which ends up inevitably targeting queer folks. And it just feels to me, sometimes I worry about young queer folks coming of age having a place, either digital or physical, to have that kind of soft landing. It feels like we're just kind of retreating further and further into gentrified private spaces, which can often be harmful. They're the kind of spaces many of us escaped from to live our lives in the first place. I'm searching for the question there, but
I'm with you. It does. Maybe we're running out of the kind of spaces that queer community could find and take and adopt and claim as our own. It was always the adjacent places that were cheaper and less patrolled and more stable to create a community in. Maybe those don't exist anymore. Maybe it's suburban. I mean, if any place can figure it out, maybe it's LA because of all the strip malls, and they can figure out how you retrofit a queer community into the same strip mall that's repeated in every LA community. Atlanta has some of the character of LA, where kind of like 7 cities and 7 suburbs in search of a city. Um, how do you adapt that kind of community when the community itself is spread so disparately? When I moved here, I always felt like there were hubs to queer activity. There was always Ansley, there was Cheshire Bridge, there was some on Ponce, and I don't see it as vividly anymore. So to me, that is kind of a social indicator. Maybe Atlanta is not the place anymore. And I do know that younger queer people, for them, maybe it's Portland, maybe it's Denver, maybe it's Seattle, maybe it's LA and New York again. Now that, well, I won't say affordable, but not prohibitively, if you have 5 people in a room, unaffordable. Atlanta has changed in the ways that's made it more like big international cities and less like the more queer welcoming place I think it might have been in the 90s and the 2000s.
Yeah.
Part of that's just growth.
Yeah, it's massive. Even just like every time I come back to Atlanta to visit, it seems totally unrecognizable in all new ways from the last time.
Yeah, I feel the same way about. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I feel the same way about Washington, D.C.
I just wanted to quickly remind folks that you can ask a question at the bottom here. There's a little ask a question button. Start getting some of those questions in there so I can start getting them queued up for later. But you were saying you feel similarly about DC?
Where I grew up, and I go back to DC now and I don't recognize it, even though there's a monument and there's a White House and there's those things. But my old cut-throughs to get to some neighborhoods, and the entire queer bar district is a baseball stadium now. And
yeah,
it's the same story. It's just, where can we go next? Nobody's really answered that.
To me, one of the most striking changes in Atlanta since I left is there's some bar I used to love that was Twin Peaks inspired, and there was a smoke-filled gay bar near it that I have fond memories of. And now I think Ponce City Market got built right across the street, and I imagine that entire area has changed.
It's so I described the restaurant I went to on Saturday morning, the boutique place, and it's next to that, and it's because it's all on the Beltline. It's our community sidewalk, and now all that's been acquired and being gentrified. And I never thought I'd feel safer on Ponce than in some other places in the city, but I kind of do now. And when I first got here, I wrote a men's magazine story for a men's magazine that's no longer in business. And it was basically about the River Ponce. If you want to find something weird, hang out on a corner in Ponce at 1 a.m, give it 5 minutes. And I don't know if it's that place anymore. I'm not sure Atlanta's that city anymore. So I wonder though.
Yeah. So shifting gears to be a little more forward looking, in some world where everything is condos, what value will histories like these hold? Can they help us imagine alternate presents or alternate futures, or are they comforting stories about bygone times that we can read to ourselves at night?
So you say it that way, and it reinforces to me the fairy tale aspect. I don't want that part of Atlanta's history to become a fairy tale. I kind of play with that in my mind. It's like I call it a legend in the beginning of the book because it's my version of it. And whether my version persists and people feel is accurate or representative, well, that's always contested. It's always open for question what people will recognize out of history. I think it's better if they recognize that this time and place had real value, and we've forgotten some of that. And the reasons why it had value, we may not recognize in our own coming out experiences or our own lives, but it certainly was valid then. And again, we have so many opportunities to write in between the existing queer histories and make it a little more continuous and not just about what the outside world perceives our history to be.
Yeah. There's kind of a interesting. There's probably some long German word for it or something, but this phenomenon of really only being able to capture our history as it's being erased. You know, we because of the struggles of telling LGBTQ history, we haven't really gotten to experience it or recogitate it kind of contemporaneously as we live through it. It's kind of like we finally get a great account of a period as all of the businesses in it no longer exist, or the street it's on got paved over or something.
And the way that we recognize history when it's a physical change or maybe a legal change and not a state of being is interesting. You know, I didn't write anything down about going out to my first queer bars when I moved here because it was always happening, and it didn't. You know, the ubiquity of it didn't strike me at the time as something I needed to keep touch with. Now it does. Maybe Facebook would have served a purpose. Maybe it was MySpace. Maybe it was Blogger. I mean, you know, pick your era. There will be fragments of that left behind. So digital world has helped us have more access to more of those moments. It creates its own. So the Instagram artificiality of history has already started to intrude on how we look at our past. And it's changed how we look at drag too, because now you talk about drag and people automatically think RuPaul for good reason. And to me, it's a whole different thing. It's like, here's the online version, the television version, the Instagram version. There's still this reality of performers in clubs who it feels very different because it's a little more extemporaneous. It's definitely more risky. And it's a livelihood and not a promotional tool. And they all serve their purpose, and there's fantastic art on both sides. But to me, they strike me as more different the more I think about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting you bring up, when you were kind of first visiting gay bars, moving to Atlanta, all this kind of stuff, not writing it down because you were just living it, right? You were just like, this is my life. I'm not making history right now. I don't need to record this, which I imagine is how kind of most people approach their lives, and that a lot of people who are gathering or congregating in Atlanta to find places of queer acceptance weren't necessarily always thinking in the moment, I'm making history or I am part of this broader trend. They were just kind of doing what they needed to survive, thrive, have fun, find love. And yet it seems like maybe part of the reason why you gravitate towards the subjects being the two central figures you did, was they both seem to kind of have a sense of the moment, which is, I think, what you maybe look for as a historian, if I'm right, someone who was thinking about the moment in kind of a meta-textual way as it was happening.
Sure, which is its own creation too, but it's also a kinship because they're writers at whatever level. So automatically, and I wrote in the intro, I feel like their lives are a part of mine because recognizing that, wanting to write it down, and wanting somebody to understand that it was important for different reasons, especially, in Bill's case, actively trying to change Georgia laws, trying to get sodomy laws off the books, trying to stop persecution. That wasn't going to show up in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, not anytime during that decade, not anytime in the decade after that. What they were both doing was developing allies, and the nucleus of the community we were all going to need help from during the entire AIDS epidemic, but particularly during the 80s, during the height of it. But yeah, I wish there were more. I've had this. There's this group that tries to acquire more archives for Atlanta collections, and we just wonder, all right, what haven't we overturned? What rock haven't we picked up to find that somebody who has a stash of photos or somebody who has a diary? Blessed diarists now, they're the ones you really want to know about. There are collections of photos that are irreplaceable, and I know where they are, and I'm going to probably spend the next 10 years trying to get them into a collection somewhere because it's irreplaceable stuff. It's well before the era of the smartphone when we could take pictures of anything at any moment. So another prohibitive thing about a book like this is that people are usually not documenting their everyday lives. They're especially not doing it in nightclubs. If they're doing drugs, if they're out drinking, if they're underage, a lot of reasons. And if they didn't have easy access to photography and recordings, all in their little smartphone. So reconstructing memories was a really difficult task in doing this. And it took a lot of interrogating what little sources there were to provide facts to back up people's their memories.
Yeah, I mean, you bring to mind what must be one of the central challenges of queer history, which is the importance of nightlife and nightclubs, but also the ephemerality and transience of those spaces. How to turn those spaces into things that can be remembered or set in stone. And maybe you can't. Maybe you just have to capture them in these vignettes in motion.
It's the only way I could do it this time. I had tried to write a book about New Orleans. My husband and I had a place there during Katrina, before and after, and I went to 30 bars in 30 days, 30 nights, and I pretended that I was, texting people, but I was taking copious notes the whole time, and it was every different kind of bar you can imagine. And I assume and I hope that there are people who are doing the same things about nightlife culture, because it's such a it's us all letting our hair down collectively. This is where you see people usually at their most relaxed and enjoying the things they truly enjoy, and it's the place that's least documented and recorded. And I hope there are people doing that now, for especially in queer bars that are the survivors. Who know, if bars are closing in San Francisco and New York, who's to say whether there won't be any at any point? I'm happy to know that there are bars thriving in small towns, but I wonder. I never had a good answer for, are gay bars dying, or are they thriving, or what? I just don't know. I think it's not the moment to judge that.
Yeah, no. You bring to mind, and I was going to ask about this, the lesbian bar project of kind of the interesting precarious space of queer nightlife right now. Bars in big cities are closing. Bars in kind of small towns or mid-size cities in red states are often kind of rising to fill a really necessary function right now, culturally and historically, in those spaces. It feels like an interesting influx moment for queer nightlife, where it's not necessarily that same heady period of possibility of the 70s, but maybe things are rising situationally where they're needed.
I hope so. One of my favorite stories, favorite's a weird way to put it, but there was a gay bar in Joplin, Missouri, and it had survived the F5 tornado in town. And the thing it couldn't survive was the casino opening nearby that had cheaper drinks, and they were friendly to queer people. And that's a meta-American story. There's always a bigger place with cheaper drinks that's going to take your crowd away, versus one that's like a community built around a community by community. And it's probably going to be a casino that does it. When we used to go to Provincetown too, and that's a town that doesn't have a high school anymore because it doesn't have enough residents, because the residents who are there don't have kids, and because the town only has like 1,000 people in the off season. But it's turned into a tourist place. It's not quite the artist colony that it used to be, and it's not quite the queer refuge it used to be. And all of the small resort places around the world that used to be like that for a certain slice of the queer world, those are kind of folding in on themselves too. So I hope somebody is out there looking at this multi-dimensional shrinking of the visible external queer community, and is it compensating digitally and online and in other ways that I'm not aware of?
Yeah, because queer people aren't going anywhere. We're still gonna exist and be born and
grow up. We're everywhere.
Yeah. Before we get to some of the community questions, audience questions, I wanted to ask you another fun question. If you could have gone to the Sweet Gum Head, describe to me your perfect night there, start to finish.
Wow. At my age, or at the age I would have gone?
Which would you? Let's hear a brief synopsis of both.
So even the owners and the manager, there's the murder trial in the middle of the book. He talks about the audience that comes to the Sweet Gum Head, and it was an early show, there was an early show, and it was an earlier crowd, and it was an older crowd, and they'd enjoy a show, and they'd be at home, watching Carol Burnett by 9 o'clock. To me, that sounds pretty sweet. But, when I first started coming out, I'd be at bars in 4 a.m. when, I've never stayed out all night. I actually never went to Backstreet, so I'm not sure if I'm real Atlanta. But my ideal night would probably start with the earliest show and find a good seat, and hopefully I was in good enough with the owner to get one of the tables near the front, because that's where Paul Lynde would sit, and that's where Patricia Nell Warren would sit, and his close friends and celebrities would be perched near the beginning. And then maybe Burt Reynolds would make his way through, and I'd get to watch him as he walked by, and maybe I'd get to tip a few performers well, go outside to the Varsity Junior, have a hot dog, come back in. I tended not to shift venues, so I'd probably be there all night if I got there early enough. I wouldn't be on the dance floor, though, because people would then see how I danced, and that would not be a good thing. I would love the music, but yeah.
That sounds like a pretty good night. There's a German word I know for sure about nostalgia for something that you haven't experienced, and I wish I could call it to mind right now.
Well, now I'm going to look for it afterwards. My mediocre German is never going to remember that word, but the club was the peak of Atlanta in the mid 70s, and but the thing, it was one of 4 or 5 bars in that intersection, so you could go to the Locker Room Bathhouse after that, then Locker Room Disco, and then you could go to Mrs. Garbo's down the street if you wanted to, and there were 4 or 5 venues. Austin has Rainy Street. I guess this was the queer Rainy Street of the day. Sweet Gum had even had a restaurant for a little while.
Yeah. It's a sign of how special the place is that the chat has been filling up with Sweet Gum Head memories or memories from this era. Before I get to the questions, I just wanted to briefly call a few of them out. Sherry Weinstein says, Sweet Gum Head was one of the secret places I frequented in 77 or 78 when I was in high school. Yay for this book. First time I met drag queens. Mark spent a night at the Sweet Gum Head instead of going to senior prom. Spent time there in high school in the late 70s. I remember seeing a production of P.S. Your Cat is Dead there as well.
Yeah.
Before my time.
There were a few plays that were staged there, and John Waters did the Desperate Living debut, the Southern debut in the club. They really branched out to do theater. They also had Jack Wrangler doing a live sex show on the stage. So, many appetites were satisfied in many ways.
Diane Hughes suggests Tom Hiddleston as Bill.
Hi, Diane. Possibly. That'd be a great choice.
I'm glad you tuned in, Diane. Sports Page and Backstreet is other. Sports Page, Backstreet, Garbo's.
Yeah. There were dozens of bars, and the owner of the Sweet Gum Head, over his career of owning bars, owned more than a dozen. Starting in the mid 60s, he managed one, the Joy Lounge, and Piccolozzi was a bartender and a manager, and the Cove, he was a part owner in its earlier edition. And, he was the godfather of the gay bar scene for a long time, and he died the year before I got here. Never got to meet him, but I have been to Sweet Gum Head, Florida, and for the curious, it's actually the name of a town, and it's sweet gum trees grow at a riverhead. It has no sexual connotation as far as I know of, but I'm sure we could all think of a couple of them.
It just kind of sounds that way, doesn't it?
It sounds that way.
It's such an evocative name. Here's some questions that we've got from folks in the audience. How can we preserve and create queer spaces at the grassroots level, asks Maeve.
That's the challenge for all the people who've operated these businesses before. And how do you grow an audience in a time where it's just so easy to sit on your couch and flip through the iPhone and do the Twitter hate scroll? I don't know, because I'm guilty of that. If our communities look more like communities, I'd have a better answer. But Atlanta's pretty suburbanized even at its core, so it makes it doubly difficult in some ways. And starting from about 2000, we kind of started actively patrolling that kind of nightlife and day life out of the community. For me, the big tipping point was 2000 or 2001, where the 24-hour clubs were shut down. And one of them did impact my life a little bit. It was around the corner, and people at 4 a.m, dozens of cars and all. So when they shut down all the 24-hour clubs, part of it was like, it's more convenient for my life. But then you see the ripple effect. Sunday nightlife in Atlanta and afternoon partying completely shut down. And it took away a part of the reason people would come here. And that was more a social hour. And unfortunately, after that, some of the big events like the raft race became more widely known for drug overdoses and for the bad side of community activity. And I really think that the Sunday afternoon thing in Atlanta was something special. And when we lost that, it changed the context of the queer life here.
Yeah. I love your analogy of Atlanta as a collection of neighborhoods, because it often feels hard to kind of feel like you can experience it as a whole place. You're just kind of a little dot moving around between a dozen different little hubs.
There's no unified field theory of Atlanta, and none that works. Yeah.
Someone's asking if you're familiar with Chris Kids near Decatur, or the efforts of places like Lost and Found Youth, or places that are helping youth who are maybe in some of these kinds of precarious situations in Atlanta that kind of, people found community in different ways in the 70s.
Only in passing. And, Bill Smith started a gay hotline for people to call if they were coming in from another part of town. And there are all those efforts to make that soft landing something that was accessible, not through nightlife. And there was a whole part of the queer community here that wanted to build a community life outside of the clubs. Totally valid. It wasn't followed as well in gay media. I'm not sure how successful it was, but sure, any pathway that gets somebody to where they need to be. How difficult must it have been in that era, though? You have to find a paper publication at a place in your small town to know that it even exists. I look at the challenge it must have been to people who wanted to change their lives from where they were in that era. And to me, that's daunting enough.
Yeah, no, something beautiful about the leap of faith of seeing something written on paper in a newsletter or a scrap in the back of a classified ad and thinking I can go here, and just getting on a train there.
Plus, being a writer, anything that shows up on paper and you believe it now, that's a win for us.
Agreed. Bernard Phillips asks, did you include the lives of the Lady Chavez, Tina DeVore, etc.?
I spoke with Tina DeVore a couple of times, and I mentioned her a couple of times, and I hope to have more to say on that future. I wasn't aware until quite late in writing that the Lady Chablis was Tina DeVore's drag daughter. And everybody who's read Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil knows the Lady Chablis, and the fact that she performed at the Sweet Gum Head a few times and was, well known on the circuit here. It's just that intersection that was one of the things I found early on. It's like, oh, so there's even a bigger story here than that. And I'll envy John Barrett to the day I die because his book is so lush, and it has that Savannah lushness to wrap itself in when it needs to and when it wants to. Atlanta doesn't. What I was writing about quickly, I realized this is a lot grittier, and being truthful to that is going to really make this work as a story.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you envy the book Savannah Lushness, because your book feels so lush in precisely that same way.
To me, sometimes in a not Blade Runner. In a depopulated way. I wrote a couple scenes that I ended up tossing because it just didn't fit the character of the book. But to me, there's this whole sense that Cheshire Bridge became beautiful that night. It blotted out the stuff that was discontinuous and kind of raggedy and haphazard, and the lights would come on and you'd see the crowds milling about the club, and the smell from the Varsity Junior just became a very sensual place at night.
Yeah, and night is forgiving, Night is forgiving of bad makeup or a sloppily assembled outfit or something. There's something beautiful and freeing about that time, and about especially those kind of adjacent places.
It's always the writer's best friend too. make it happen at night. People know weird shit goes down at night. So, yeah.
And you bring to mind, I mean, just like the beautiful diversity of people who kind of populate these spaces and these times. And something comes to mind for me with, you know, having written my own book and realizing that in a lot of kind of blue state, coastal big city LGBTQ history, often the story is about, you know, cis white gay folks getting way out ahead of the trans community and people of color in the queer community in terms of like securing rights and protections. And I'm not saying Atlanta hasn't had that same dynamic in ways, but to me, it's always seemed like cities that are dealing with Republican state legislatures, everybody's been kind of held down longer. And so everybody kind of seems a little bit more cohesive, maybe. They're still splintering, but I feel like you find more and more different kinds of people sharing space sometimes, both presently and maybe in the archives.
And in the queer publications. And, you know, one of the regrets is I know all these other people who I wanted to write about and I couldn't. They didn't leave as much behind. And there's one performer from the club who everyone, I'm sure they'd love to read more, Lisa King. She was right there the whole time along with Rachel Wells. And I just didn't have enough about her other than one interview she did about leaving This Week on Med. And, you know, it was sad, and she was angry over some of the things that happened to her as a performer, and it just didn't feel representative. There wasn't enough of it. And I kind of regret not being able to include that. And again, I just keep hammering home the message: record, write down, tell us your story, get it somewhere, because we want better representation universally. And maybe in some ways this is a artifact of the past that will eventually make its way out of queer histories, but the archives were thin to begin with, and I relied on writers to help me do this. And one of them did it from the past, and one did it from the present. And I just, some of these other characters I could have gone on and on and on about. I just couldn't find any more about them.
Yeah, I think it's really beautiful to think that, you know, some of your subjects maybe didn't know who they were writing to, but they ultimately wrote to you, and that's a lesson for our present. Of writing down, you might not know who you're writing for, but someone in the future will maybe make something out of those words, tell an important story. One last victory lap question: how does it feel to receive such a positive response to your work? Asks Horace Holloman.
I love that people are reading it that I never expected would. It's almost like a guerrilla mission that I have to get people in on queer history who may just want to read a story about a famous Atlanta murder trial, or maybe they want to read more about Maynard Jackson, or maybe they want to just read more about disco, and they get told a story of queer liberation. And it might not have been the reason for coming in, but I'm making it a reason for them to take it away.
Yeah. Well, this has been really lovely to talk to you. I've had so much fun, and I want to kick it over to ER to give a few words about the book and how we can all get our hands on it.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Martin, I just have really loved this book so much, and I'm really grateful for the work that you did. And as I am for your book as well, Samantha. I feel like these are the kinds of histories that I and contemporary studies that I have really hungered for, and so this is a real treat, and I'm really grateful to have you both here. So thank you both so much. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.